Let's start with something very simple, almost childish in its simplicity. Have you ever noticed that your day doesn't just end because you decide it ends? You might tell yourself, I'll stay productive for 18 hours today, or I'll study late tonight, or I'll just push through. And sometimes you do push through. But then something subtle happens. It doesn't feel like a decision. It feels like a gradual loss of control over clarity. Your thoughts become slightly slower. Your attention starts slipping off the edges of things. You read the same sentence twice. You forget why you walked into a room. And eventually, even if nothing dramatic happens, you simply stop being as good at thinking. Now, the interesting question is, why does this happen in such a consistent way across almost all humans? If you look at human life across cultures, geography, and history, you find something surprisingly stable. Most people stay awake for roughly 15 to 17 hours and then sleep for about 7 to 9 hours. This pattern shows up even in places without electricity, without modern schedules, without alarms. It shows up in hunter-gatherer communities, in rural villages, and in industrial cities. That already tells us something important. This is not just a modern habit. It seems to be something deeper in the biology. Now imagine for a moment that you are designing a biological machine from scratch. Not a metaphorical machine, but something real that has to move, think, respond, make decisions, and survive in a changing environment. You would quickly run into a problem. Continuous operation sounds attractive, but it creates hidden costs. Systems that run too long without reset tend to accumulate errors. Signals become noisy. Efficiency drops. Overheating in a biological sense is not just about temperature. It is about chemical imbalance, neural fatigue, and diminishing precision in computation. So one natural design choice would be to introduce cycles. Periods of activity followed by periods of deep recovery. Not because inactivity is desirable, but because it preserves long-term function. Now here is where things get interesting. Human beings do not experience this cycle as something imposed from the outside. There is no visible switch that says, now you must get tired. Instead, the system produces internal signals that gradually change your state. You feel alert in the morning without thinking about it. You feel stable through much of the day. And then, slowly, something shifts. It is not like a light turning off. It is more like a battery that doesn't suddenly die, but loses voltage in a way that changes how every component behaves. At full charge, everything works smoothly. At lower charge, the same tasks become more expensive for the system. Thinking requires more effort. Emotional control becomes slightly less stable. Focus becomes harder to maintain. What makes this especially tricky is that the decline is gradual enough that you do not notice it moment by moment. You adapt continuously. So your internal experience still says, I am fine, even while your performance is measurably changing. This creates a kind of illusion. You feel continuous, but your biology is not continuous. It is drifting through states. And by the time you clearly feel tired, the process has already been unfolding for hours. So when we talk about a 16-hour schedule, we are not talking about a rule written in the universe. We are talking about a pattern that emerges from the way biological systems degrade and recover. A pattern that is stable enough to appear universal, but flexible enough to vary between individuals. And the real mystery is not just that this pattern exists. It is why evolution settled on something like this balance at all, instead of something longer, shorter, or entirely different. Now let's continue by looking at something even more interesting. The idea that there isn't just one clock inside your body, but at least two systems quietly interacting all the time. To understand this, imagine you are inside a very carefully engineered machine. Not a simple machine with one switch, but something more like a layered system with multiple timers running at different speeds. One of these systems is constantly building up pressure the longer you stay awake. The other is trying to predict when you should be awake or asleep based on environmental patterns like light and darkness. The first system is easiest to imagine if you think of it as a kind of invisible load accumulating in your brain. When you wake up in the morning, this load is at its lowest point. You feel clear, your thoughts move easily, and mental effort feels relatively cheap. But as the hours pass, something begins to accumulate. Not fatigue in the vague sense, but actual biochemical changes in your nervous system. Certain molecules, like adenosine, slowly build up as a byproduct of neural activity. The more your brain works, the more these signals accumulate, and the more they begin to interfere with sharp, efficient firing of neurons. A helpful analogy is to imagine a clean glass window. In the morning, it is clear. You can see through it effortlessly. But as the day goes on, dust starts to build up on the surface. At first, you don't notice it. The world still looks sharp. But over time, the accumulation becomes impossible to ignore. The view is still there, but it requires more effort to see clearly through the same window. This is what wakefulness does at a biological level. It does not suddenly break your brain. It slowly increases the cost of using it. Now there is a second system running at the same time, and it is just as important. This system does not measure how long you have been awake. Instead, it tries to estimate what time of day it is, regardless of whether you are asleep or awake. It is deeply connected to environmental light, especially sunlight entering your eyes, and it uses that information to regulate hormones, temperature, alertness, and energy levels. Deep in the brain, there is a small cluster of neurons that acts like a timing coordinator. It receives light signals and helps synchronize internal processes with the external world. When morning light enters your eyes, it sends a strong signal. It is time to increase alertness. As evening approaches and light fades, it gradually shifts the system toward rest. But here is the key point. This system is not perfectly accurate. It is not reading a clock on the wall. It is estimating time based on patterns of light and darkness, and those patterns can be disrupted by artificial lighting, irregular schedules, or travel across time zones. So now you have two systems interacting. One is steadily increasing sleep pressure the longer you stay awake. The other is cycling through daily phases of alertness and rest readiness. In the early part of the day, these two systems support each other. Sleep pressure is low, and the circadian system is promoting wakefulness. This is why mornings often feel naturally clear without effort. But as time progresses, the systems begin to drift apart. Sleep pressure rises steadily, while the circadian system eventually starts to lower alertness signals as evening approaches. At some point, usually somewhere between 14 and 17 hours of wakefulness, these two influences cross in a very meaningful way. The internal drive to sleep becomes strong enough that it competes directly with the brain's ability to maintain stable, high-quality cognition. This is where you begin to notice lapses in attention, slower thinking, and reduced mental precision. It is not that your brain suddenly stops working. It is that two biological signals, each smooth on its own, begin to interfere in a way that changes the overall behavior of the system. And what makes this even more fascinating is that you don't experience it as two separate forces. You experience it as a single feeling. I am tired. But underneath that simple feeling is a layered interaction between chemistry and timing, between accumulated load and environmental prediction, both running continuously whether you notice them or not. Now we can go a little deeper, because this is where the story becomes less about biology alone and more about perception itself. One of the most misleading things about being human is that we are extremely bad at noticing slow changes in ourselves. If something changes suddenly, we can detect it easily. A loud sound, a sharp pain, a sudden loss of balance. The brain is very good at responding to those kinds of events because they matter for immediate survival. But if something changes gradually, the brain tends to smooth it out. It builds a continuous story instead of showing you every small step. This becomes important when we talk about wakefulness. Imagine your mental performance as a line that slowly slopes downward over time. At hour 1, you are at full capacity. At hour 5, slightly less. At hour 10, a bit more decline. At hour 15, noticeable reduction. But at no single moment does your brain say, now I am worse than before. Instead, it updates continuously, always giving you a sense of normality relative to the immediate past. This creates a very strange illusion. You feel like you are stable, even while your actual cognitive efficiency is changing in measurable ways. Think of it like walking slowly downhill in fog. You do not notice the slope because there is no reference point. There is no sharp edge telling you that something has changed. You simply keep walking, adjusting unconsciously, and assuming the ground is flat. This is one of the reasons humans often say things like, I was fine all day and then suddenly I crashed. From the inside, it feels sudden. But from a biological perspective, it is almost never sudden. It is the end result of a long accumulation of small changes that never crossed the threshold of awareness until they collectively became too large to ignore. Now here is another important point. Feeling awake is not the same thing as performing well. This is where intuition and biology begin to disagree. You can feel alert, talkative, even energized, while your brain is already showing measurable declines in accuracy, working memory, and decision stability. In other words, the subjective experience of being fine is not a reliable indicator of actual cognitive performance. This is similar to how a machine can continue running while slowly accumulating errors in its output. The machine does not necessarily feel worse. It simply produces slightly less reliable results over time. The human brain is particularly vulnerable to this, because it is both the system doing the work and the system evaluating how well the work is being done. There is no external observer inside your head constantly measuring performance. So the brain relies heavily on recent experience as its reference point. If the last hour felt normal, then the current moment also feels normal, even if overall performance has drifted downward compared to earlier in the day. This is also why sleep deprivation is so dangerous in practical situations. People often underestimate its effects because they rely on subjective feeling rather than objective function. Reaction time slows. Judgment becomes more impulsive. The ability to suppress incorrect answers weakens. But the internal experience does not always clearly reflect these changes. What makes this even more subtle is that humans adapt continuously. As performance declines slightly, we unconsciously adjust expectations and behavior. We simplify tasks, we rely on habits, we avoid deep thinking without realizing it. So we maintain the feeling of functioning normally, even while operating at a reduced level of complexity. In this sense, the brain is not lying to you. It is doing something more interesting. It is maintaining a coherent experience of continuity, even when the underlying system is gradually shifting states. And this brings us to a deeper question that science still struggles with. If our perception of ourselves is so tightly bound to relative change rather than absolute state, how many other aspects of our experience are similarly constructed? Now let's be honest about something that often gets ignored in simplified explanations. We do not fully understand what sleep is for in a complete sense. We know many things about it. We know what happens when you don't get it. We know certain brain waves appear during different stages. We know memory consolidation improves after sleep. We know the body regulates hormones, immune activity, and metabolic processes differently during sleep. But if you ask a deeper question, what sleep is doing as a whole system, the answer becomes less precise. This is important, because in physics or biology, knowing the parts is not always the same as knowing the whole behavior. Think of a city at night. From above, you see lights turning off in patterns. Some areas go dark early, others stay active longer, and some switch on and off in cycles. If you were an alien observer trying to understand what sleeping means for the city, you might notice that activity decreases overall, but you would also notice something more interesting. Maintenance begins. Roads that were busy during the day are now being repaired. Systems that were overloaded are being reset. Waste that accumulated during activity is being removed. Communication networks that were saturated are being reorganized. But even if you observe all of this, you still might not be able to reduce it to a single simple purpose, like the city shuts down to rest. That would be too simplistic. It is not just inactivity. It is structured reorganization during inactivity. Sleep may be similar. The brain does not simply turn off. It transitions into a different mode of operation. Some areas become more active than during wakefulness. Others reduce activity significantly. The system shifts its priorities. External input becomes less important. Internal processing becomes dominant. But here is the difficult part. We still cannot fully explain why this particular structure of sleep exists. Why not shorter cycles? Why not continuous low-level maintenance without full shutdown? Why not a different architecture entirely? Evolution does not always produce the simplest possible design. It produces systems that work well enough under constraints over long periods of time. Sleep may be one of those solutions that is not optimal in a mathematical sense, but stable in a biological sense. Another complication is that sleep is not a single uniform state. It is made of multiple stages, including deep sleep and REM sleep, each with different brain activity patterns. Deep sleep is associated with slow, synchronized neural activity, while REM sleep resembles waking brain activity in some ways, especially in terms of vivid internal simulation. This raises an even more difficult question. Why does consciousness itself shift into such different modes during sleep? Why does the brain generate dreams that feel real while disconnected from external input? We can measure correlations, we can describe patterns, but the deeper explanation of why subjective experience takes this form during sleep is still incomplete. And this is where science becomes honest about its limits. We are not dealing with a fully solved system. We are dealing with a partially mapped process inside a system that is studying itself from the inside. It is like trying to understand a mirror while looking only into the mirror. You can see reflections, patterns, distortions, but you are always inside the system you are trying to describe. So when we talk about sleep as part of a 16-hour wake cycle, we should not think of it as a neat, finished explanation. It is more like a working model. A model that explains a lot, predicts a lot, but still leaves fundamental questions open. And sometimes, those open questions are not signs of failure. They are signs that we are still looking at something deep enough that it cannot be compressed into a simple story without losing something important. Now let's put all of this together and look at the bigger picture, because this is where the idea stops being just biology and starts becoming something closer to a general principle about how living systems behave. If you step back far enough, the 16-hour wake window is not really about hours on a clock. It is about limits in a system that must constantly balance two competing requirements. One requirement is to stay active, gather information, move through the world, make decisions, and respond to change. The other requirement is to preserve internal stability, repair damage, and restore precision in the machinery that makes all of that possible. These two requirements are in tension with each other. Activity creates wear, and repair requires inactivity, or at least a different mode of operation. You cannot maximize both at the same time without cost. Now think about what evolution is actually doing. It is not designing perfect machines. It is not solving optimization problems in a clean mathematical space. It is working with constraints, limited energy, changing environments, predators, food availability, social demands, and random mutations over long periods of time. So instead of asking, why is the system exactly 16 hours, it may be more accurate to ask, what kind of balance would survive long enough to reproduce and remain stable across generations? In that sense, the wake-sleep cycle is less like a fixed law and more like a stable rhythm that emerged because it works well enough under many conditions. But here is something deeper that often gets missed. The feeling of being awake is not a direct measurement of your true cognitive state. It is an interpretation constructed by your brain based on internal signals and recent history. That means your experience of functioning is always slightly lagging behind the actual physical state of your system. This creates an interesting consequence. You are never experiencing your brain in real time. You are experiencing a kind of edited version of it, where many small changes are smoothed into a continuous narrative of me functioning normally. Because of this, the decline that happens across a long day is not perceived as a slope. It is perceived as a stable state that suddenly becomes unstable only when it crosses a threshold. But from the perspective of the underlying biology, there is no threshold in the way we intuitively imagine it. There is only continuous change. This also helps explain why different people report different limits. Some people feel sharp until late at night, while others lose focus earlier. It is not that the underlying mechanism is different in principle. It is that the parameters of the system vary. Genetics, habits, light exposure, stress, and sleep history all shift where that balance point appears. But even with these differences, the structure remains remarkably consistent. Wakefulness accumulates cost, sleep restores function, and the interaction between those two processes produces a repeating cycle that is stable enough to define human life patterns across the world. There is also a deeper philosophical point hidden here, although it comes directly from the science. We tend to think of ourselves as continuous, stable entities moving through time. But what biology suggests is something slightly different. We are not constant systems. We are oscillating systems. We move through phases of higher and lower efficiency, higher and lower stability, higher and lower coherence. In that sense, you at hour 2 of the day is not exactly the same you at hour 16, even though the brain creates a seamless narrative that makes them feel identical. And this is where the idea becomes more subtle. The 16-hour cycle is not just a rule about sleep. It is a reminder that what we call a stable self is actually a dynamic pattern maintained over time, not a fixed object. You are not a single state. You are a process that keeps restabilizing itself, over and over, within the constraints of biology, chemistry, and time. Now, there is a question that naturally follows all of this, and it is worth looking at carefully because it exposes something deeper about how humans think. If this system is so consistent, if it follows such clear biological and physical constraints, why does it feel so flexible in real life? Why can one person work late into the night, another struggles to stay focused past evening, and another seems to function almost independently of time for a while under pressure? The answer is not that the system is broken or inconsistent. The answer is that the system is adaptive, and adaptation can hide structure in ways that are easy to misinterpret. Think of it like a river. From a distance, it looks like a single smooth flow. But if you zoom in, you see turbulence, small currents, eddies, and variations in speed. The overall direction is consistent, but the local behavior is constantly changing depending on obstacles, depth, and terrain. Human wakefulness works in a similar way. There is a general structure underneath, driven by biology, but it is constantly being shaped by context. Stress is one of the strongest modifiers. When the brain perceives urgency or danger, it can temporarily override signals that would normally reduce alertness. This is not because the underlying need for rest disappears, but because other systems prioritize short-term survival or goal completion over long-term maintenance. Attention and novelty also play a role. New or interesting stimuli can increase dopamine signaling, which temporarily enhances focus and reduces the subjective feeling of fatigue. This is why people can sometimes stay awake much longer than expected when they are engaged in something highly stimulating. But here is the important part. These are not eliminations of the underlying cycle. They are temporary shifts in how strongly different signals are weighted. The sleep pressure does not disappear. The circadian rhythm does not stop. They are still running in the background, accumulating and shifting as before. This is why extended wakefulness often comes with a delayed cost. When the external stimulation ends, or when the brain can no longer maintain compensatory mechanisms, the underlying fatigue becomes suddenly more visible. It is not that the fatigue appears at that moment. It is that the masking system stopped covering it. This creates a mismatch between subjective experience and biological reality. You may feel fine while under stimulation, and only later realize how depleted your system actually was. Another subtle point is that humans are extremely good at adapting their expectations. If your baseline changes slowly, you will recalibrate what you consider normal. This means that a slightly degraded state can begin to feel like full performance simply because you have adjusted your reference point. This is a powerful cognitive feature, but it comes at a cost. It makes long-term changes in performance harder to detect without external measurement. From a scientific perspective, this is not surprising. Any system that relies on internal feedback must use relative comparisons. Absolute measurement would require a stable external reference, which the brain does not always have. So what we call feeling normal is actually a dynamic comparison between your current state and your recent history, not a comparison with an objective ideal. And this is where the deeper insight emerges. The 16-hour pattern is not just a biological limit. It is also a perceptual boundary. It defines the range within which your internal model of yourself remains stable enough to feel continuous. Beyond that range, the system does not immediately collapse. Instead, it becomes less reliable, less precise, and more dependent on shortcuts. And because those changes are gradual and adaptive, they rarely feel like a sharp transition. They feel like normal life until suddenly they don't. What makes this fascinating is that it shows how closely perception and physiology are intertwined. You are not simply observing your body from the outside. You are a model built by that body, continuously updated, continuously approximating itself under changing conditions. Now we reach the part where it becomes important to admit something that science is very comfortable with, but people often find uncomfortable. There are real limits to what we currently know. We can describe the 16-hour wake cycle fairly well in terms of patterns. We can measure brain chemicals, electrical activity, hormone changes, and performance decline. We can even build mathematical models that approximate how alertness rises and falls across a day. But if you ask a deeper question, why does consciousness require sleep at all? The answer is still incomplete. We do not have a single unified explanation that fully connects all levels of description. We can go from molecules to neurons fairly well. We can go from neurons to behavior fairly well. But the step from physical activity in the brain to subjective experience, and then back to why that experience must shut down in a structured way every day, is still not fully understood. This is not a small gap. It is a fundamental one. For example, we know that during wakefulness, the brain accumulates certain metabolic byproducts. We know that synaptic connections strengthen and weaken as you learn and experience things. We know that neural networks can become saturated, noisy, or less efficient without periods of reset. These are solid findings, but we still do not fully understand why the brain cannot simply maintain itself continuously without entering a global offline state like sleep. Some parts of the brain do reduce activity during rest, but others become highly active. So sleep is not a simple shutdown. It is a reorganization of activity patterns that we still cannot fully explain in a single framework. Another unresolved question is why sleep has such a structured architecture. There are cycles within sleep itself, including deep sleep and REM sleep, each with very different characteristics. Deep sleep is associated with slow, synchronized brain activity. REM sleep, on the other hand, looks strangely similar to wakefulness in terms of brain activation, yet occurs while the body is mostly disconnected from external action. Why does the brain alternate between these states in this particular sequence? We can describe it, but we cannot fully derive why this structure is necessary or optimal. There is also the problem of dreams. During REM sleep, the brain generates complex, vivid experiences that can feel real while they are happening, despite being disconnected from external sensory input. We can identify correlations between brain activity and dreaming, but we do not yet have a complete theory that explains why subjective experience takes this specific form during sleep. This is where science becomes careful. It avoids filling gaps with assumptions that feel satisfying, but are not supported by evidence. Instead, it builds partial models that work within limited domains. And this is important because it shows something deeper about how knowledge itself progresses. Understanding is not a single jump from ignorance to completeness. It is a gradual expansion of boundaries where each new layer explains more, but also reveals new questions that were not visible before. In that sense, sleep research is not a finished story. It is an active field where each answer tends to create two new questions. We know more than we did before, but we are also more aware of how much remains unknown. And this uncertainty is not a weakness of science. It is part of its structure. Science only works because it refuses to treat incomplete explanations as final truths. So when we talk about the 16-hour cycle, we should be honest about its status. It is not a fully solved equation. It is a strong, evidence-based model that explains a large part of human behavior, but still sits inside a larger unknown system. And that larger system includes not just sleep, but consciousness itself, and the relationship between physical processes and subjective experience, which remains one of the deepest open questions in biology and neuroscience today. If we step back far enough, something interesting happens. The 16-hour wake cycle stops looking like a standalone biological trick and starts looking like a special case of a more general idea. Living systems do not stay in one state for long. They move, they oscillate, they switch modes. And that is not just true for sleep and wakefulness, it is true at almost every scale of biology. Your heart does not beat once and stop. It oscillates, your lungs do not hold air and stay fixed. They cycle, your neurons do not sit in one stable firing pattern forever. They fluctuate constantly, even your metabolism is not a flat line. It rises and falls depending on demand, time of day, food intake, and internal regulation. So the wake-sleep cycle is not an isolated feature. It is part of a much larger pattern in nature where stability is not achieved by being constant, but by constantly returning to balance. This is a very important shift in thinking, because intuitively people often imagine stability as something fixed. A stable system is imagined like a rock, unmoving, unchanged, permanent. But in biology, stability is almost the opposite. It is dynamic, it is maintained through continuous change. Think of riding a bicycle. If you stop moving, you fall. Stability requires motion, not randomness, but controlled adjustment. The same idea applies to wakefulness. You are not stable because your brain is static. You are stable because multiple systems are continuously adjusting in the background, correcting drift, managing energy, and balancing competing demands. Now the 16-hour pattern becomes easier to understand as a boundary condition rather than a rule. It is the range in which the system can maintain effective control over its internal stability while still interacting with the external world. Beyond that range, the cost of maintaining high-level cognition increases faster than the system can compensate for. That does not mean the system stops working. It means it begins to prioritize survival-level efficiency over precision. And this leads to a subtle but important idea. Biological systems are not designed for maximum performance at all times. They are designed for acceptable performance over long periods with minimal catastrophic failure. That means occasional inefficiency is not a bug. It is part of the design space. Sleep in this sense is not an interruption of function. It is a periodic recalibration that allows the system to continue functioning at all. There is also something deeper here about how we experience time itself. We tend to think of time as a continuous flow that we move through. But biological time is not experienced evenly. It is segmented by internal states. When you are alert and engaged, time feels structured and dense. When you are tired, time can feel fragmented or distorted. This is not just psychological interpretation. It is tied to how neural systems process information at different levels of efficiency. So your experience of a day is not just a measure of 24 hours. It is a constructed narrative shaped by cycles of attention, fatigue, recovery, and re-engagement. From this perspective, the 16-hour wake window is not just a biological constraint. It is also a framing device for consciousness itself. It defines the length of the segment in which your brain can maintain a coherent, high-resolution model of the world before it must reset. And that brings us to a broader realization. What we call normal life is actually a repeating structure of breakdown and repair, clarity and decline, integration and reset. Not because something is wrong with the system, but because that is how stable complexity is maintained over time in a physical universe governed by energy limits and entropy.